Socrates says, "I think we may be allowed to assume that the soul is immortal." So what does that mean? Is Plato saying that the soul is immortal and lives on after death? What's the origin of this idea, and how can we even know if it's true? Let's examine Plato's argument for an immortal soul. Our story begins in the ancient Greek city of Athens during the 4th century BC. Here we meet a man named Socrates, who was known for his wisdom and his love of knowledge. One day, while walking around the city, he came across a group of people discussing what happens to a person after they die. They were wondering if their souls would live on, or if they would simply cease to exist. Socrates listened intently to their conversation, and then shared his own thoughts on the matter. He believed that the soul is immortal, and that it continues to live on after the body dies. As the discussion continued, Socrates began to explain why he believed in an immortal soul. First, he pointed out that the soul seems to be a separate entity from the body. He said that sometimes our thoughts and feelings seem to be present without any physical sensation or bodily movement. For example, when we dream, we experience emotions such as fear or joy without our bodies reacting physically. This suggests that the soul, which is responsible for these emotions, exists independently of the body. Socrates also observed that the soul appears to be eternal, having no beginning or end. He argued that if the soul were created at the time of our birth, then it must have always existed because it could not have started from nothing. But what is Plato's idea of the soul? How did he view its nature and abilities? To answer this question, we must look to one of his dialogues titled Phaedo, which contains a detailed account of his theory. In this dialogue, Socrates engages in a conversation with his students about the immortality of the soul. He presents several arguments to support his belief, including the idea that the soul is a form of knowledge that can never be destroyed. According to Socrates, the soul has the ability to understand and comprehend abstract concepts such as justice, beauty, and truth. This knowledge is not based on sensory experience or physical evidence, but rather on pure reason and intellect. Therefore, the soul cannot be destroyed by physical forces or external circumstances, since it is not dependent on the physical world. Another argument Socrates uses to prove the immortality of the soul is the idea that it is a source of moral goodness. He believes that the soul is capable of distinguishing between right and wrong, good and evil, and that it strives to do good at all times. This moral compass guides our actions and decisions throughout our lives, even when we are tempted to do evil. If the soul were mortal and subject to the laws of the physical world, then it would be possible for it to be corrupted or destroyed by evil influences. However, since the soul is immortal and possesses an inherent goodness, it can never be truly corrupted and will always strive to do good. The idea of the immortal soul was not a new concept when Socrates developed his theory. It had been explored by other philosophers and religious thinkers before him. However, Socrates' approach to the topic was unique. He did not rely on faith or religious beliefs to support his arguments, but rather used reason and logic to try to prove the immortality of the soul. He believed that through careful examination and contemplation of the nature of the soul, one could come to the conclusion that it is immortal. In addition to his philosophical arguments, Socrates also drew upon his personal experiences to support his belief in the immortality of the soul. He recounted stories of people who had died and then come back to life, claiming that they had traveled to the afterlife and spoken to the dead. These accounts, while not considered factual by modern standards, were an important part of the cultural and religious beliefs of the time. Socrates acknowledged that these stories could not be used as evidence in a philosophical argument, but they did serve to reinforce his own belief in the immortality of the soul. However, Socrates' arguments did not go unchallenged. His students and fellow philosophers raised objections and asked questions that he had not considered. This led to further discussions and refinements of his theory, as well as the exploration of alternative ideas about the soul and the afterlife. The process of questioning and answering was an essential part of Socrates' method, and it helped to shape the development of philosophical thought in ancient Greece. Despite the challenges to his ideas, Socrates remained steadfast in his belief in the immortality of the soul. He saw the soul as a divine and eternal part of humanity that set us apart from other creatures and gave our lives meaning and purpose. For Socrates, the fear of death was overcome by the knowledge that the soul was immortal, and that our true existence lay in the realm of the mind and spirit rather than the physical body. Many of Plato's ideas were revolutionary and controversial in his time, but his theory of the soul was particularly groundbreaking. It challenged the traditional Greek view of the soul as something that could be easily corrupted or destroyed, and offered a more nuanced and complex understanding of the human psyche. Plato's work on the soul had a profound impact on the development of philosophy, theology, and religious thought, and his ideas continue to be studied and debated today. But let's get back to the original question. Does Plato think the soul is immortal? From a strict literal perspective, the answer is yes. In the dialogue Phaedo, Socrates explicitly states that he believes the soul is immortal. However, the situation is more complicated than a simple yes or no answer can convey. What makes this question tricky is that Plato uses the word immortal in a non-traditional way. In most people's understanding, immortal means that the soul will live on forever in some kind of heaven or afterlife, usually alongside some sort of judgment as to whether one lived a good or bad life. But Plato doesn't focus so much on where the soul goes after death, or whether it faces any sort of judgment. Instead, Plato focuses on the etymological definition of immortal. By definition, being immortal means that the soul cannot be killed or destroyed. This idea is presented in the Phaedo dialogue, when Socrates is explaining his reasons for believing the soul is immortal. He argues that if the soul were mortal, that is, if it could be killed or destroyed, then it would have been impossible for it to come into existence in the first place. He explains that the soul must have always existed and will always exist, because it cannot start from nothing or cease to be. That's because anything that comes into being must come from something else that already exists. And by the same token, anything that ceases to exist must go somewhere or become something else. Since the soul cannot be in more than one place at once, it cannot go anywhere or become anything else. Therefore, it must have always existed and will always exist. So does this mean that Plato believes the soul will live on forever in some kind of heaven? Not necessarily. This argument only proves that the soul is not mortal, but it doesn't say anything about what happens to the soul after death, or whether it goes to heaven or hell. Plato doesn't really discuss these questions in his surviving works, which is one of the reasons there is so much confusion about his views on the afterlife. In conclusion, to answer the question of whether Plato thinks the soul is immortal, the answer is both yes and no. Yes, because he believes the soul is not mortal and cannot be killed or destroyed. But no, because he doesn't say anything about what happens to the soul after death, or whether it goes to heaven or hell. If you found this video helpful, please remember to share 4 more philosophy videos. Thanks for watching.